Good morning, students. I speak to you this morning from the pulpit, the Dos Palos Church of Christ. Don't worry, I'm not about to preach a sermon to you, but we have a religious topic that's of great importance to some of the major reform movements that occurred during the early and middle part of the 19th century. Now, the idea that we're going to look at today is an eschatological idea. Eschatology is a study of the end times. In Christian terms, it's people trying to figure out when Jesus is coming back and associating that with the end of the world. Most of these different philosophies about Jesus' return are based on different interpretations of the book of Revelation. One example from modern times would be dispensational premillennialism. Many evangelical groups today believe in this kind of eschatological understanding, the idea being that Jesus will return, come back to earth, and then establish a 1,000-year reign on earth. That's why it's called premillennialism. Jesus comes back, and then you have the millennium. This series of books and movies called Left Behind is based on that principle. But what we're going to talk about today is called postmillennialism. Almost no one today still believes in postmillennialism, but as you can probably gather from the term, the idea behind postmillennialism is that there's going to be 1,000 years of peace on earth, and then Jesus is going to come back at the end of that millennium. You might be asking yourself at this point, if Jesus comes back after 1,000 years of peace on earth, how does the 1,000 years of peace on earth happen? Well, that's what makes postmillennialism unique and such a motivating factor for people who believe in that kind of line of thinking about Jesus' return. It's not Jesus, but man who allows this 1,000 years of peace to happen on earth. In postmillennialism, God's people have to get the world right. God's people have to perfect it in order to trigger Jesus' return. In other words, it's Christians' responsibility, it's the church's responsibility to make the world more godly and establish this 1,000 years of peace on earth so that the second coming can happen, so that the fulfillment of God's plan can occur. Man, that's a huge responsibility, isn't it? But think about what Tom Ritchie said regarding Arminian theology in that other video that you've watched in this unit. He said it was American in its very nature, that it was very appealing to Americans because in this Arminian way of thinking, people now had a choice about whether or not they'd respond to the gospel. They had a say in it, a role. Well, apply that same kind of thinking to eschatology, to the millennium. In postmillennialism, people now believe that they could actually usher in the second coming of Jesus. Man, that's a huge responsibility. That's power. You say, okay, well, that's a huge idea. How then did it affect the way that people did things in their churches and in their world? Well, first of all, it provided an incredibly motivating factor in their lives. Think about the motivation that people would take from this idea that they could trigger the fulfillment of God's plan by perfecting the world that they lived in. It was a hugely strong motivational factor for people. And it motivated them in the way that they applied and the way that they set up their churches and the way that they sought to reform their world. Now, the major reform to churches can be best seen through what we would call today the American Restoration Movement. In Mr. Ritchie's video, he talked about Methodists and Baptists. There were really three major groups that saw great expansion and growth during the Second Great Awakening. And the third one was people that called themselves the Christian movement. You think, well, that doesn't set them apart very much because, a lot of people call themselves Christians. They're not one specific, unique movement. Well, what set them apart really was that they were restorationists. Now, the goal of this Christian movement was not to create or establish a new church or a new denomination. Their goal was to restore simple New Testament Christianity, its very basic form. Their idea was that if you just looked around, you could see all of this discord and strife and infighting that had disunified Christianity since the time of the Reformation. And they thought it was generally because people had followed all these different man-made doctrines and routed themselves down different paths that had been divergent, had been disunifying, that had created a church that was a lot more fractured than what God had originally intended. So the idea was that if we could just all be Christians and use only the Bible and focus on what unites rather than the divisive doctrines of men, if we could all be just Christians, that once that restorationism had been presented to people, that the doors of the churches of all the denominations would just fly open and people would flood out of those and unite around this idea of being just Christians. Well, it was a little bit of an overly optimistic idea, but that unification was part of a process of perfectionism that people believed had to happen in order for the church to be fully restored, have its 1,000-year reign on earth, and ultimately trigger in the millennium. Again, it doesn't have to be literally 1,000 years, but they believed that they had to restore this pure, simple New Testament Christianity in order to trigger the fulfillment ultimately of God's plan and the return of Jesus to earth. You say, wow, that's a pretty grandiose plan, and it doesn't appear to have worked. I mean, it's a movement, but it still kind of appears to be one in many. So how does this have any impact on American society as a whole? Well, where you will see the most impact, and where you will see this all dovetailing in with the stuff that you read in your book, was in how this idea of perfectionism, of making the world more godly, by people not just who are members of that Christian movement, but Christians of all stripes, including Methodists and Baptists and many of the mainstream churches of the day, that motivated all of these people not just to reform their churches, but to seek out to make America a more godly nation, a more perfect nation, a more holy nation, one that would ultimately be a signal that that reign of peace had been established so that the second coming would happen. People didn't always directly make that parallel in their minds. A lot of people did directly make that parallel, and some others were just carried forward by this spirit of perfectionism that led them to initiate these kinds of reforms. But just think about all the different reform movements that were initiated during this period. You can see all of them in your book. There's a lot of them listed in there. Many Christians interpreted this perfectionism and applied it in such a way that they sought to rid their society of alcohol. There's a very powerful temperance movement. That's what it was called. Your book talks a lot about that. It's a very powerful temperance movement. And the roots of that movement were based in not only Christianity, but in this idea that the world needed to be perfected. Otherwise, who cares if that other guy on the street is drinking? You know, we care because we need to make our world Christian, holy, godly, in order for the second coming to happen, if you're a postmillennialist. Postmillennialists, Christians, motivated by this perfecting factor, sought to end Sunday work. There was a movement called Sabbatarianism. At the time, post offices, which you wouldn't guess this today, they were seen as a place that you could get together and gossip. People would go there, men would go there after church on Sunday and maybe have a drink and sit there and read the paper and talk about gossip and things like this. It was seen as kind of a place of ill repute. It was open on Sunday. A lot of Christian people didn't like that and sought to end work, to end post offices, to end just about anything, any kind of work from being done on Sunday, based on kind of a legalistic interpretation of Sabbath law from the Old Testament. Ultimately, it did come to fruition. 100 years later, the post office finally stopped delivering anything on Sunday. Now they take every possible federal day off that they can, including Sunday. May not be working on Saturday for much longer. At any rate, there were societies for the betterment of all sorts of groups, societies to end child labor, and most significantly, a movement to rid the country of slavery, all that had their roots in this idea that every little good deed that we could do in America would make the world one closer to the second coming of Jesus Christ.